So today I'd like to share with you a beautiful little car that we've done some work on, and it's a 64 Porsche 356C, and current owner bought it in 65, and so it's a two-owner car, and we're just kind of getting it running and driving better. He was considering selling it, but I think now it's such a good driver he's going to keep it for a little bit, which is fantastic. Might as well enjoy it. So the first thing he had me do was actually rebuild the carbs and get those all synced. And did that at his shop, and then he had an electrical problem too, which was someone had accidentally put the battery in backwards, and luckily this car can take that. That's the advantage of being an antique. But so anyway, later he had a list of projects he wanted done, so we actually brought it to the shop. Just much easier, much more room to work around it. And of course, as you can see from some of the videos, the Kingpins and link pins were actually pretty well shot. So the engine has been rebuilt in this car. He thinks in the 70s, and he might have 15,000 miles on it. But suspension really hasn't been touched, especially at the level of Kingpins. This is a very unique car with having Kingpins and disc brakes, so there's some old and some new technology. But right in front of you, I'm actually trying to show you how bad the link pins were, but since both of those kind of have spring pressure on them, you didn't feel it while driving. One of the reasons I thought I'd share this with you is it seems like some of the Kingpin stuff is kind of a lost art. Should have filmed a few more steps of it, but it's one of those when you're by yourself. You set up camera and just work. Of course, yeah, and then also going through the car and just seeing what it was going to need. The front discs were dragging really bad, and that was partially because of the type of guide pin system that's used in these. Traditionally, the guide pin mechanism in the center was taken out more for raced applications, but a lot of people now will just take them out, and it was a little bit of overkill in engineering, which, well, it's a German car, no surprise. One neat aspect with this car, and I wasn't aware this era did that, but you can see the grease cap in the center of the hub there. There's a little cotter pin in the center, and as we kind of go through, you'll kind of see the spindle's hollow. So actually this odometer cable is going through the hub and is driven by that grease cap. So a little bit of an unusual design there. So and one thing in the rebuilding the brake calipers is actually used a grease gun on this one, which you pretty much have to because of that inner guide pin system. A lot of cars you can use compressed air. You've got to be very cautious because they will come out rapidly. The grease is a very nice option because it's a nice slow push out. You just take a grease gun, adapt a greaser to it, and pump that in where the brake fluid goes. And worked excellent on these because that inner mechanism. And of course, when you're trying to rebuild something like this, some of these bolts have not been off since the factory put them in there, so that can be a challenge. Soak things down, take your time. Less stuff you break, the easier it'll be in the long run. So yeah, this car's just a wonderful blend of some old and new technology. This is one of the early cars with four-wheel disc brakes. There's no power booster to it. It's just a manual brake system. But the car's so light that it's actually a very good system. But yeah, still has those Kingpins and essentially a Volkswagen front end. Of course, the engine is essentially Volkswagen design, but much more refined, and of course better fuel distribution with having the twin carburetors. And shifter and everything in this is just wonderful to drive. Definitely like this car. It was a fun one to work on. Now and then on the Kingpins themselves, one thing to remember is you generally are going to have to ream them. This particular model, the steel pin itself is in tight enough. You really need to press. I didn't film that part. I actually neighbor's shop has a really nice press, so I walked up, just used his, and that was necessary on this car. But um, once you put in the new bushings, you're gonna have to ream those, and that's where I think I'm one of the few shops in the area that still has a whole set of reams for various American and imported cars. But yeah, some cars you can actually drive your pin in just with like a large C clamp. Um, but this one is extremely tight on that. And then also it has the two link pins that are going over it. They're a lot like a Kingpin, but one of the differences you have to shim those such to get your wheel camber correctly. So there's some nice instructional guides online that will show you how to measure top and bottom control arms and then stack up your shims to get that correct. Another option on your getting your kingpins put in place on the spindle is one of the manuals. In fact, that may be the factory manual mentioned. Essentially, putting the spindle in an oven to heat it up, expand the metal so the pin will slide in easier. Of course, with that, you also could consider putting the kingpin itself in the freezer, and of course contract that a little bit. When you got slip fits like that, you're dealing with very small dimensions to make the difference. Personally, I opted for the press because that's what I had. You just have to be cautious in some aspects. Also, when putting in the link pin bushings, you got to make sure that the hole for the grease lines up with where the grease goes in. Otherwise, you'll never get grease where it needs to go. And so I did push the link pin bushings in with essentially a large C clamp. It's actually part of a ball joint remover install type kit, so worked pretty good. These were of course very. So, and you can see here I'm actually measuring for the shims for the link pin. So basically you put one straight edge on the farthest out one, which usually should be your lower, measure the difference, and then there's a table to tell you how many shims on either side to put. You basically will always have a shim against that, kind of serves as a little bit of a bushing, and yeah, that's one of the other tricks on these. So yeah, beyond the obvious suspension and a bit of brake work, there was had to replace one of the little heater control valves, rework some of the other controls for that heat control around the engine box, replace the gaskets for some of that system also. A few little electrical things like brake switch and a few bulb connections. And so this car also had really squeaky windshield wipers, so that was one of the other projects. We tore that system apart. For the most part, it just needed re-greasing, but of course the rubber seals and that going through the body had to be replaced. But so we also did some cosmetic work on this car. It rear bumper wasn't really attached right, so it didn't have the little rubber isolator on the side. So we had to take the bumper off and buy the components it was missing to get that done. They'd broken a couple bolts inside the bumper, so it was a little more challenge to get that part of it fixed. And then the front bumper, of course, had been off at some time and had thread problems there too, but we got both ends kind of squared away. The other big one the owner wanted to accomplish was some point he had broke the factory mirror. They replaced with something that looked similar to what would be on a 356C, but it looks like what he originally had was from the B series, so the earlier car. So we found one that worked for that, and I have to agree with him. It's a much nicer option for this car. And thanks for watching.